All right, let's go. So, in announcements, we are officially one full lecture behind schedule now, and that's completely due to the fact that I was long-winded in other lectures, so that's just kind of the way it worked out. So consequently, as I said in the email announcement earlier, we don't have a quiz for today, because essentially we're just trying to reset the quizzes so they're now lined up with the lectures again. So, but there is a quiz posted for Thursday, which covers monitoring. Lost my balance. All right. Lab will be in 119 again for various reasons. We were hoping to get out to alfalfa and look at some weevils, but they just showed up. I went out and swept and I caught like 2 of them, which isn't really enough to make it interesting. It's supposed to rain all week. The alfalfa was co-planted with some sort of wheat, so it's kind of weird out there right now. But essentially, the point is that it's wet and rainy, and there's no point in being outside in it. So we'll be doing an exercise in lab today and Thursday. So moving on, ecosystems, what we've been building up to. So essentially, we make a big deal in IPM about how IPM is ecosystem-based. It's all about agroecosystems and taking advantage of them. So ultimately, having a fundamental idea of what drives ecosystems is useful information to have when you're trying to come up with a way to manage pest systems. And so just to define the system, the ecosystem is the level at which the community starts interacting, not just amongst, so an ecosystem is a community of interacting and interdependent populations of plants, animals, microorganisms, all of those. And so that's the community. But then on top of that, we start seeing these communities interact with the non-living aspects of the environment. So we're not just talking about how pests feed on crops. We're not just talking about how natural enemies feed on pests. We're starting to look at questions like, what is the best regimen of irrigation to reduce my phytophthora problem? What is the fertilization rate that's not going to cause aphid outbreaks? Those sorts of things. So we're interested in not just the living organisms, but also all of the things in the environment that help living organisms survive, but aren't themselves living. And I think that the best way to look at ecology and to look at ecosystems is to think of it all in terms of energy flow. And to think of it as almost like a pseudo-economic system, right? That basically humans go around and go to great levels of extravagance and sort of complication in order to acquire money to survive, sort of an economic problem. But you can almost think of ecology as being the extent that organisms will go to gather their currency, which is energy, the basic components that they need to stay alive. And all of the complexity that we see in nature, in agroecosystems, is all basically judged around that basic instinct to gather energy. So if we're talking about energy in ecosystems, what would be the grand source of energy? The sun. The sun, right? Exactly. Sunlight is the primary source of energy in all ecosystems. There are some organisms that can survive, basically feeding off of heat energy from deep sea vents, or consuming various sulfurous compounds produced in the Earth's crust, but they tend to be very simple and they don't get very complex. What it really comes down to is that we've got a great big orb of plasma and hot gas about 8 light minutes from the planet, and it's just irradiating us with energy all the time. And so naturally, some of that energy has converted itself into living organisms that take advantage of it. So ultimately, what this comes down to, though, is that it kind of highlights the importance of one particular class of life in ecosystems, arguably the most important class, and that would be the primary producers. Those organisms that can take that energy from the sun, which is more or less completely useless to other living organisms, and can harness that energy to build biological molecules. They can store that energy in the bonds of atoms in order to make that energy biologically available to others. And that allows us to see sort of this buildup of organic material and complex ecosystems, whereas if we didn't have primary producers, we'd just be a big hot rock in the floating around. So, when we talk about energy flow, one of the key concepts that we talk about in ecology is the idea of trophics and trophic levels. And trophic levels are really just a tool that ecologists use to explain how energy flows through ecosystems. So if energy is what everybody wants, if energy is the whole point of life and it drives life, where does it go and how does it move around? And so as I mentioned earlier, the first really key step in this is that you need to have some sort of organism that can take that energy that's essentially completely abiotic. It's energy from the sun, doesn't inherently benefit anybody or anything. It's just solar radiation. But you need some sort of organism that can take that energy, that sunlight, and convert it into a biologically available form, a type of energy that other organisms can take advantage of. And that's where our primary producers come in, or our autotrophs. So basically anything that's photosynthetic. Plants, photosynthetic bacteria, some protists. There are some single-celled eukaryotes that do it as well. But these are just the organisms that convert the sunlight into energy. So I guess if you wanted to extend the economics metaphor, you could think of it as like people who have work-a-day type jobs. You're going out there, you're doing work, and you're gathering money for your benefit. However, just like in systems where money accumulates in certain places in high concentrations, there are naturally going to be people who don't want to work for money, but would rather just take money from others who have earned it for themselves.
Oh, parasite.
Yeah, the parasite, or in this case, the primary consumer. As predators arguably fall into this as well. And not all parasites are terrible. I think that my son is very charming, but he is essentially my most sweet and adorable little parasite. But my wife doesn't like it when I say that, so don't tell her. Since you don't know my wife, just don't say I said that. I don't care, she'll be fine. So anyway, where is I going with this? Right, so just like there are individuals who will jump out with a big stick and take your money, there are organisms that will take energy from one another in ways that are much easier than photosynthesis. And this is where you get herbivores, such as this grasshopper right here. Our primary consumers take energy from producers. And then further up that chain, of course, you've got organisms that will prey on those organisms, because if all of a sudden you've got a bunch of primary consumers that are gathering all the energy, they're the next big hot ticket of energy that needs to be consumed on top of that. And so we build up the chain, moving up the links. That secondary consumers, or base level carnivores, consume the primary consumers. Then there are tertiary consumers that may feed upon those organisms. And then ultimately what we have finally are the decomposers. These are the organisms that basically don't care where they're getting their energy from, just so long as it's dead. And they can break it down and just sort of take all of the leftover residual energy in the bonds that they have in their bodies and just break that down for themselves. And so in ecology, we talk about this in terms of trophic levels, right? In terms of how energy moves. But we could also think of this in a much simpler term that we probably learned in like 4th grade biology, which would be the food chain, right? This also just describes how organisms feed and what they feed on and what they are fed upon. Because ultimately, energy exchange is all about consumption. Any questions on this before we move on? We're good. So, this ultimate design that the ecosystem settles upon is what we call its trophic structure. So the trophic structure is essentially the I had some candy. This is making it hard to talk. So, the trophic structure is ultimately sort of the design of how energy moves in an ecosystem. It just describes the specific steps that the energy goes through. And so trophic structures can vary dramatically between ecosystems depending on the organisms that live there, depending on the amount of energy that they get, whether you're say, an equatorial island that's getting baked with sunlight all year round, or if you are you're a deep sea organism living in the Arctic Ocean. You're going to have vastly different structures based on the availability of energy and the availability of primary producers that can take advantage of that energy. So, before I move on to that, one important thing, though, that we do see in trophic structures is that they seem to be inherently limited in how long they can get, and how long these food chains can be. That in most cases, what you'll see is you'll see primary producers, you'll see primary consumers, you'll see predators, but the reality is that tertiary consumers are relatively uncommon. Most ecosystems have at least one, but there's not a ton of them. And there's virtually no organisms that would be quaternary consumers, or things that feed on predators of other predators. We just don't see that. And it sort of seems like, well, if there's energy to be had, if there's something that can feed on snakes, why don't we have something that feeds more or less exclusively on snakes? And so ecologists really looked at this question, got curious about it, and what they came up with a solution is this idea of the rule of 10%. And so what the rule of 10% suggests is that when we have these energy transfers, when energy goes from the sun to the plants, or from the plants to the herbivores, it's a really inefficient process, that the vast majority of the energy is lost because organisms are just inherently inefficient at converting energy between different forms. So when a plant is receiving radiation from the sun, it is in theory receiving, well, I should just click again. There we go. So you can think of the sun, since the sun is more or less the sole source of all energy on the planet, minus minor amounts from, sort of the core and geothermic cycles and things like that. If you think of the sun as having essentially 100% of the energy, the idea is that a plant is receiving a full dose of that energy when it's out there photosynthesizing. But a lot of that sunlight is getting reflected off of the plant. A lot of it is getting turned into heat energy on the leaves. A lot of that energy is being lost when the bonds are formed and is getting released out as radiation of other forms. So the plant ultimately isn't storing up 100% of that sun's energy as in their biomolecules. It's only getting about 10% of that energy. The other 90% is getting dissipated out and lost. Similarly, when an herbivore comes along and feeds on that plant, it's not going to be able to break down 100% of all the biomolecule bonds. It's not going to be able to capture all the energy it does release. There's a lot of inefficiencies there. So it's only gathering 10% of that 10%. So if you think of it, it's getting 10% of the plant's energy, which really translates to 1% of the energy that came from the sun. And so if you move up the chain, you end up with secondary consumers getting 0.1%, tertiary consumers getting 0.01%. And you get to a point where essentially, if you're an organism that's decided that you want to feed on snakes, right? You're going to expend way more energy finding snakes than you're ever going to gather from eating those few snakes that you do find. It's kind of like if you decided you're going to go live in the wilderness and feed entirely on mountain lions because you have some misguided desire to do so. Since mountain lions have home territories that are in the range of hundreds of square miles, you're going to spend way more energy trying to find a mountain lion and shoot it than you're ever going to get out of mountain lion steaks that you get from that single mountain lion, right? So that's the basic idea, is that because of this loss of energy, trophic levels very rarely get much more than 4 or 5 levels. That generally, this seems to be the maximum of sort of complexity that we get in living systems. Now, I'll admit, this is a little misleading. I'm going to get rid of this next time. So I put the 0.001% for the decomposer, but that would only apply if it was feeding exclusively on carnivores. Decomposers tend not to care what they're feeding on, as long as it's, something they can eat. So decomposers are not just feeding on carnivores, they're feeding on herbivores, green plants. They're getting their energy from all over the place. So don't think of decomposers as the last step. Think of decomposers as sort of an alternate pathway off of every step in a trophic structure.
So then they'd be more efficient than that, or probably even more efficient than primary consumers?
Not so much that they're more efficient. So the transfer is still going to be 10% no matter what, right? It's just they have more food sources to get that energy from. So they probably have to spend less time finding food sources. So I guess in that sense they are more efficient, if you think about it. It just depends on what they specialize on. Interesting thought.
Well, like anything else, the population depends on the food availability. Now, you're not going to find a whole lot of decomposers out in the middle of the desert.
Right. No, exactly. That's true. And so, yeah, ultimately that gets to the abiotic components that we'll get to a little bit later. But so right now, just to clarify, we are only talking about biotic components. So we're talking about how living organisms interact with one another. In a little bit, we'll get into abiotics, so the non-living components and how they interact with living organisms. But yeah, you're right, exactly. If you're in the desert, it doesn't matter if you're getting blasted by the sun if you don't have enough water to string two molecules together. But yeah, so, all right. So Aldo also brings up an interesting point, which is the idea that there's kind of an inherent limit to the idea of these simple string-line trophic structures or food chains. Because the reality is it doesn't really address the fact that lots of organisms don't fit neatly into a single trophic level. There's very few organisms that are just straight up carnivores, right? There's also a lot of organisms that aren't just straight up herbivores. We have organisms that feed on multiple other organisms. Maybe they feed on different food sources over the growing season or over the season generally. Maybe they have omnivorous diets. So they're sometimes herbivores, sometimes carnivores. And so ultimately, food chains are just too simple to explain that. And so trophic structures tend to be a little closer to food webs, which again, probably pulling way back to like 4th grade biology classes. But essentially just the idea that food webs are a much better example of how energy flows in systems, mostly because they've got flexible links of how energy flows. And so they show sort of nicely how organisms interact with one another. And what's kind of interesting from an ecological perspective is that ultimately, the more energy there is in an ecosystem, the more sunlight that gets converted into biologically available energy, the more complex these trophic structures get, the more complex these webs get. Because you generally have more energy available, you have more unique ways for organisms to get at that energy, so you get lots of unique niches, lots of unique life plans for organisms. And so that's why you do see things like, rainforests in South America, where you've got a ton of nutrients, a ton of water, a ton of sunlight, and you can get tons of energy produced, as compared to things like the Mojave Desert, where you've got lots of energy, but very little of it being converted. So you end up with very sparse ecosystems, very sparse food webs or trophic structures. And so just as an example, moving from something like this as a food chain to something like this, you can see there's some real advantages to thinking about things in terms of food webs that I don't need to go into great detail about, but just that something like this allows us to look at things with greater complexity. This is a simple agroecosystem, an alfalfa field. So we've got things in here such as omnivores, the humans, which may eat the various organisms that feed on alfalfa, but may actually eat alfalfa themselves. Think bean sprouts, alfalfa sprouts, as opposed to actually out there eating alfalfa plants themselves. We've got things like parasites that don't actually necessarily feed to kill all the time, though in this case they do. You've also got really unusual situations like cannibalism, Lacewings really like to eat everything, including one another. So lacewings actually have a strategy to avoid this, which is that lacewing eggs are laid out on a leaf, and then they're laid out in little clusters on a string with an egg at the end, like this. The idea is when this hatches, and you got like a little lacewing larva, it has to crawl all the way down the string to get to the egg, to get to here onto the leaf. And once it's down there, it's not going to notice the other eggs hanging out. Whereas if the eggs are taken off the strings and are just put out down on the leaf, when they hatch, they'll just immediately eat all the other eggs. So it's just a strategy by the organism to avoid the offspring eating one another. But anyway, so that's cannibalism. That's an aside. All right. And so one other thing to keep in mind is that organisms are all looking for energy, right? And they're trying to take it from one another. And this leads to all sorts of interesting interactions between organisms that maybe go beyond just strictly eating one another, which would be things like competition, or the interaction between organisms in which they contest for a limited resource. So basically any situation where two organisms are trying to get the same thing, whether it's a food source, a water source, mates, shelter, any number of things, as long as they are in a situation where one of them is going to get it and the other one isn't, or is going to get one of inferior quality. So we break up competition into two major camps. We've got intra-specific competition, which would be competition between members of the same species. So just to go back to the alfalfa example, let's say you've got an alfalfa plant with some aphids on it, right? They're going to clone themselves and just keep building up their population on this plant. But the reality is that they're all feeding on the same food source. They're all feeding on the same phloem from the alfalfa. And so you'll get to a point where ultimately you have so many aphids on the plant that any food that aphid A is eating on is food that aphid B can't have. And there's not enough to go around for everyone. So those aphids are effectively competing with each other. And with aphids, it's kind of interesting because they're all genetic clones of one another in many cases. So it's like they're competing with themselves from an evolutionary perspective. But that's another aside. But so intraspecific competition is important in terms of IPM from the perspective of oftentimes intraspecific competition determines how pests disperse. That if they're all sharing a host plant, or if they're all sharing a field, and it just starts to get too competitive, they're going to start leaving. They're going to start trying to find other resources to feed upon. So when aphids get too crowded on a plant, what they do is they start producing clones that have wings. And those wing forms transfer out into neighboring plants to start feeding on them instead. On the flip side, we have interspecific competition. This is competition between members of different species. So interspecific versus intra, I think the easy way to remember this is that interspecific, think international. International relations are relations between different nations. Interspecific competition is between different species. So it's all about being different. So this would be like if we had those aphids feeding on that alfalfa, and then a new species got introduced from another country. And this species is way better at feeding on alfalfa than the aphids we had before. And so they land on the plant, and they reproduce so quickly, they feed so efficiently, that they start to push that other aphid out. That other aphid can't really keep up with them. And so the original aphid's population gets smaller, 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 until it eventually either dies out or it has to find a new host. And so where this is important is that this oftentimes results in what we call competitive exclusion. So this is essentially that interaction I just talked about. It's when one species reduces the population to the other to the extent that that species has to leave and find a whole new area to survive. And so this is something that can drive natural selection. It's oftentimes it's theorized, it's hard to prove when species occur because it happens over such a long time span, but it's theorized that competitive exclusion is important for driving natural selection and the emergence of new species. Yeah. And so in terms of, agroecosystems, this isn't so important on the short scale as it is in the long scale. And of course, there are situations in agroecosystems where we have interactions between biotic organisms, between living organisms, that don't necessarily harm one another, but actually benefit one another. So this would be sort of the opposite of competition, where one organism gets the resource and the other doesn't. In a mutualism, two organisms basically have a reciprocal relationship where they both benefit, right? Obvious example in agriculture would be like mycorrhizae, the symbiotic fungi that live inside plant roots, that the fungi get protected from the environment. They also get energy from the plant. The plants get all of the nutrients that the fungi can gather from decaying things in the soil. I was listening to a podcast recently about a researcher. She was a forest ecologist up at the University of British Columbia, and she was looking at the interaction between trees in boreal forests and their fungal symbionts. And she had demonstrated that fungal symbionts get as much as 80 to 90% of all of the energy the tree produces, that the tree only ends up using like 10% of the energy that it produces through photosynthesis. But on the flip side, the tree gathers almost all of its nitrogen and other compounds through the mycorrhizae. And interestingly enough, she even had some evidence that some mycorrhizae don't just sit there and decompose things, but they actually hunt out and kill small insects. So in that case, it's almost like trees are predatory, which is kind of an unusual way to look at it. But ecosystems are goofy. To take an interesting concept and boil it down into a silly nonsense phrase. And of course, other things we see would be things like aphids and ants, where this is a mutualism that does not benefit, but actually is a pest problem. That aphids feed on plants, and they excrete honeydew, which is their concentrated sugar, urine, essentially. And ants love nothing more than honeydew. There are certain ant species that subsist almost entirely off of honeydew in trees. And so ants will basically feed on the honeydew produced by the aphids, and the benefit the aphids get is they get protected by the ants from natural enemies. Ants will pick up the aphids and move them from a dying plant to a healthier plant. Some ants will even pick up aphids and take them down into their colony at wintertime and let them feed on tree roots so that they have a food source and they don't die out during the freeze. So, yeah.
Do those aphids turn white?
Sorry?
Do those aphids turn white?
I would be curious. I'm not sure. I haven't looked into that. Have you found white aphid? There are some aphids that do feed naturally on plant roots. So,
I'm just wondering, because it's below the ground, there's going to be chlorophyll to those things turn white. So
right.
Turn
Turn green. Yeah, I'd be curious. You get that. On the flip side, ants can be cruel to aphids in the sense that when aphids get too crowded, I mentioned earlier, they start producing aphids with wings. If ants see aphids with wing buds, they'll tear them off their bodies so they can't fly away. You get some odd things like that. Another aside, just because I think aphids are interesting, and any class you take with me is going to be a primer on aphids. Aphids produce what are called alarm pheromones. So some species of aphids, if you disturb the plant or if you crush one, if an aphid gets hurt, it'll release an alarm pheromone. And that alarm pheromone tells all the other aphids that bad stuff is going on, and so those aphids will drop off the plant and run for cover. And so this is why sometimes you can sample aphids by taking a plant and just banging it on like the side of a bucket or into a white dish, because they'll hit the ground, aphids will all scatter because they think something bad's happening. And so you'll get aphids that basically fall off and run away. But in ant-tended colonies, you don't see that anymore, because the ants are protecting them. When they release the pheromone, the aphids don't have any reaction. They just stay there and wait for protection from the ants. What the pheromone does is it gets the ants super irritable, and they start going around looking for predators. They look for parasitic wasps, for lady beetles that they can attack. And so it's kind of a pheromone that's been usurped for a different purpose in this particular system. So anyway, that's another aside. I'm not going to test you on that, but I think mutualisms are really interesting, and aphids have tons of them. So, getting back to what I'm supposed to teach you about. I could feasibly be supposed to be teaching you about aphids and ants. Anyway, it demonstrates a purpose. Someday, so I'm recording all this. It's going to go into my RTP package, my tenure package. I'm hoping that someone listens to like this lecture and hears me talking about them hearing it, and it'll just be this really unusual experience for them. We'll see if it pans out. Anyway, so competition is clearly important, right? Whether it's direct competition between members of the same species or between members of different species, competition oftentimes determines which species gets energy, which one gets water, which one gets resources, and which one dies out. And so naturally, you can imagine that organisms have developed all sorts of strategies to help them deal with competition, to be more competitive in certain scenarios. And what's kind of neat is that there's this ecological theory which basically groups organisms into two major camps of competition strategies. The first of which are what we would call R strategists. So R strategists are organisms that basically don't do really well in highly competitive systems. Their general feeling is, why should I try to compete with someone who can outcompete me when what I can do instead is I can get into the system before everybody else does and reproduce like crazy and just take over the place, right? And so these are organisms that basically have two major characteristics. First off, they have a really high rate of reproduction. And secondly, they're very efficient at finding hosts. So these are the organisms that will fly into an ecosystem really quickly, establish themselves, and reproduce like crazy. They'll produce a ton of eggs, a ton of offspring, or seeds if you're a weed, and just sort of take over the joint. And so these are rapid colonizers. You can think of our species as being more or less all of the pests that we see in agroecosystems. So, for example, if you go out and plow a field, right, get rid of all the weeds, what comes up out of the ground?
Weeds.
More weeds, right? Because weeds produce a ton of seeds that hang out in the seed bank. They produce seeds that are really good at dispersing, so even if you don't have a really great seed bank, they might blow in from the edges. Weeds grow crazy fast, and they hit their reproductive stride early in their life cycle, right? So weeds are quick. That's why you don't plow a field and have a ton of maple trees coming up, because maple trees take too long to reproduce. They're never going to get to that reproductive stage before you planted your crop and harvested it. But weeds will. And so with that, we oftentimes refer to our strategists as being short-run species. They're not interested in establishing shop. They're not interested in spending their whole life and many generations in this one setting. They're just there to get what they can, and then they move on to the next disturbed habitat that they can fit into. So these guys are really well suited to these high disturbance systems like agroecosystems, where we're always harvesting or plowing. We're always setting up these nice open niches for organisms to jump into. And so the reason we call these guys R strategists is if we think about logistic growth like we talked about on Thursday, right? Populations grow exponentially at first when there's basically a lot of available resources. Then as they hit the carrying capacity, they slow down. We call this first exponential growth the R phase. And basically we call them R strategists because they target this R phase. They like systems where there's tons of resources and very little limits. On the flip side, the second strategy is what we call K strategists. So K strategists are sort of the opposite of ours. They have very slow reproduction. They have very long lifespans. They produce very few offspring. And the offspring they do produce, they tend to get a lot of parental care. So you could think of humans as being K strategists, right? So basically they don't show up very early. They take a long time to get through everything. But ultimately, though, they are super competitive in narrow niches. So these are organisms that have a niche that they fit into, and they fit it better than anybody else. So they can pop themselves into that niche, and even if it's jam full of those R strategists, it'll slowly just push them out over time. Downside for K strategists is that they're long run. They need a long time to work it out. So they do really well in complex ecosystems, areas that aren't going to be disturbed multiple times a year like an agroecosystem. And so as such, we don't see a lot of K strategists as weeds or as pests generally. Generally, case strategies you may see in an agroecosystem would be like woody weeds. More so, and you would see those, of course, in the areas of the field that get disturbed the least. You're more likely to see woody weeds on the field edge, maybe in poorly cultivated vineyards or orchards that are going to be more long-lasting. Wood-boring beetles. But generally, case strategists aren't going to show up. And we call them case strategists because they do really well when the ecosystem starts to hit its limiting factors, when you're up near that K capacity. They do really well there, pushing everybody out. All right. So those are all of the biotic compounds that we were talking about, that I wanted to talk about, all of the biological interactions. But as I mentioned before, ecology is not just about biological interactions, but it's about how living organisms interact with the non-living environment. And so we need to talk about abiotic components, things such as minerals, soil, water, temperature, climate, all those things that can affect how organisms develop and interact, but don't in and of themselves provide energy. They influence growth, but they don't give out energy to allow it to happen. So for the most part, we think about these components in terms of cycles, whether we're talking about the water cycle, which I'm not going to review because it's the water cycle. If you don't know the water cycle, congratulations on getting this far. So, but anyway, but what we will talk about is biogeochemical cycles, because water's not the only thing that cycles. Essentially, all things that are used by living organisms cycle in one way or another. And these cycles really determine how available minerals and inorganic elements are, and it's just sort of a matter of cycling between living organisms that are using them and cycling then into the environment where they're not being used at the moment. And this is sort of the cycles that govern a lot of the important biomolecules, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, chunks, as you've probably learned before. Nobody's ever learned that, I just made that up. It's not a thing. All right, so there are two major categories, bless you, of biogeochemical cycles that we talk about. And they're basically determined by where the abiotic reservoir is, where these molecules go when they're not inside a living organism, and we call these sedimentary and gaseous cycles. So I think this is a useful figure in sort of visualizing how these cycles work. And I think the important thing is to realize that essentially, for any given molecule, there are two places it can be in this model. It can be inside the organic pool, or it can be outside of it in a reservoir. So basically, if a biological molecule, let's say nitrogen, we'll just talk about nitrogen. If nitrogen is in the organic pool, that means that it's inside an organism in one fashion or another. It's in a protein, maybe it's being used to build DNA, maybe it's being stored as some sort of nitrogenous energy compound. It's inside the organism. So by being inside the organic pool, it's being used by something that's alive. And so nitrogen can enter the system. Maybe it's drank in water, absorbed by roots. Maybe it's fixed by a bacterium or breathed in. Basically, there's a number of ways for these molecules to get in, but they all leave generally by being either excreted or the organism dies, at which point that feces or that organism get decomposed by bacteria, and the molecule gets reintroduced into the environment. So once it's in the environment then, there are the two major reservoirs it can go into, which are represented by the circles. On one hand, if it's a gaseous, on one hand, it can go into the atmospheric reservoir, which means that when it enters the environment, it's going to enter it as a gas. And it'll spend the rest of its time in the atmosphere until it gets breathed in or converted into, basically fixed by bacteria into a nitrogenous form. So basically, these are abiotic compounds that are part of a gaseous cycle. So a gaseous cycle just means the atmosphere is the reservoir, and it includes things like oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, those sorts of guys. On the flip side, if the major reservoir is solid, you're a sedimentary cycle. If you basically are decomposed and you're something like sulfur that gets built into sort of mineralistic type compounds before being integrated into a living organism again, you're part of a sedimentary cycle. So again, gaseous cycles, the atmosphere is a reservoir. Sedimentary cycles, the earth is the reservoir. And so basically these abiotic compounds just sort of go back and forth between these. And I'm not going to go into great gobs of detail how each and every one does it. You can learn that on your own, or you could learn that in a soils class, those sorts of areas. So, and then finally, in terms of agroecology, when we're talking about abiotics, you could basically sum up all of this in terms of the importance of soil, right? That soil is the primary determinant of species composition, especially in terms of crops that we plant, being that things like texture, the amount of organic matter that's available, as well as the cation exchange capacity, are all factors that really determine what plants will thrive, how well water will be retained in the system, all of those sorts of things. And so again, I'm an insect ecologist, so not going to go into great gobs of detail. But as Dr. Bennis likes to say, she's encountered a lot of students who say they wish they knew more about soil. So soil is worth looking into, and I know you all have to take soil courses, so I won't belabor the point. But let's move on. All right, so finally, how do all of these things come together into the ecosystems that we are preparing ourselves to work in, agroecosystems? So agroecosystems, then, are basically any ecosystem that's managed in some way to benefit people. So typically we think of agroecosystems as agricultural fields, but if you wanted to spread it out, you could say that technically a forest that's managed by foresters is an agroecosystem, as is a rangeland. And at the very extreme, you could even say things like golf courses, public parks are agroecosystems, because they are manipulated by humans for human need. But the important thing about agroecosystems is that they are fundamentally different from natural ecosystems. All the things we just talked about still apply, but they apply differently in agroecosystems than they would in natural systems. And for a wide variety of reasons. Perhaps the most important of which is that agroecosystems lack temporal continuity. And what I mean by that is that they change very quickly. We tend to disturb them a lot. If you've got some crops, you have some plots of land where you may be planting multiple crops in any given year. On the flip side, you may have, on the long scale things, you may have vineyards that hang out for a couple of hundred years. But at the same time, 100 years is nothing in terms of evolutionary or ecological time. And so a lot of these sort of principles don't apply there. Agroecosystems are dominated by human-selected plants, right? We choose what goes into these agroecosystems, whereas natural ecosystems arrive at their communities based on what the environment is suited for and what is available in the surrounding areas. Whereas humans, if we want to grow rice in California, even though nothing like rice has ever grown here before, we can do that. We can just pick them up and drop it off here and grow it. And so you got some really unique systems. There's generally less diversity, less genetic complexity, and shorter food webs. So generally the lesson here is that agroecosystems are less complex. You've got very simple plant structure, which translates into very simple herbivore structure, very simple predator structure, and so the food web doesn't get very big. You have uniform vegetative structure. Because we essentially want to harvest the entire thing at the same time, we don't plant some tomatoes, 1 month and then a month later plant some others. We want to plant them all at the same time, so we only have to hire someone to pick them once. Well, that's not necessarily true in tomatoes, but so you can spend less time harvesting. And so, whereas in natural ecosystems, you tend to have plants at all sorts of different life stages at any given time. We typically add abiotic compounds, whereas natural ecosystems kind of have to cycle their own nutrients. So nitrogen, sulfur, all of that need to cycle naturally. If we don't have enough nitrogen in our system, we just add it. You go out, you buy some fertilizer, you dump it into the system. And then finally, all of these things kind of add together to create a system where we have really frequent outbreaks of pests. Essentially, natural ecosystems, most organisms are fairly well regulated. They've got lots of checks and balances so that it's difficult for one species to get completely out of control and wipe out another species. But in agroecosystem, because we've reduced the complexity, because we've created a situation where we have a ton of energy and a ton of plants on the life stage at the same time, and because we've selected a single plant to dominate, we've essentially created a smorgasbord for certain organisms that has no real checks on it, that can keep it under control. And so, hence, the reason we're taking IPM. So let's look at some of these in a little more detail. So as I mentioned before, in natural ecosystems, we have a sort of abiotic nutrient cycle like this, right? Where things come into the organic pool, they leave, but then they cycle back in. But in agroecosystems, this cycle is open. Whenever we harvest something, a lot of that nitrogen is tied up in whatever we harvested. And so that's nitrogen that's no longer going to go back in the soil. It's not going to go into organisms that feed in that area. It's nitrogen that's going to go to some guy living in like France or something, where they're going to consume that American almond. And that's nitrogen that's never going to come back to California. Well, it will eventually, but not anytime soon, probably. Either way. And so we have to put that back in manually. So essentially, when we have this release of organic compounds, it doesn't need to be by bacteria. It can just sort of shoot out naturally off on its own. And so on the flip side, we actually have to start adding amendments to replace those nutrients that are missing. So we just basically can add 2 extra arrows to this model to sort of get an idea of how agroecosystems work in comparison. As I mentioned before, agroecosystems have much more simplified trophic structures. So generally, by having less primary producers, we basically are only allowing certain herbivores, certain carnivores to come into the system. And so just to give you a basic comparison, here's that alfalfa agroecosystem we talked about earlier. This is a Serengeti ecosystem, or a food web. And it's actually really not filled in very well. They only have about 3 plant sources, and they don't touch on near the insect diversity that you have. But even in this very reduced food web, you can see there's a lot more arrows. There's a lot more complexity, a lot more interaction between these species in a natural ecosystem than we see in agros. Which on one hand can be bad in agroecosystems because these pests can get out of control, but on the upside, it does allow us to sort of manipulate systems so that our natural biocontrols can really take off and do very well without having to interfere with other species. And then finally, as I mentioned before, agroecosystems, because they're short-lived, we basically have a situation where more or less everything that lives there, including the crops, are adapted. They're all organisms that are highly competitive, grow quickly, fruit quickly, reproduce quickly, and there's really no room for K-adapted species excepting the humans that are ultimately benefiting from these species. So finally, the grand revelation of ecological pest control is that because of all of these sort of characteristics of agroecosystems, because we basically control how much energy goes in, we determine the species that go in, and we can manipulate them, we can basically identify limiting factors in agroecosystems that benefit pests, and we can remove them. So I'm sure you've seen the barrel analogy before. If you've taken entomology, you've definitely seen it. The idea that you can think of ecosystems as being something like a barrel with different length staves. And the amount of pests in the system is determined by the lowest stave. It's the water inside the barrel. That essentially, if all of the staves are needed to keep the water in, if you lower one of them, it's going to flood out. I'm not doing a good job of explaining this. So what we'll do is we'll just touch on this very briefly on Thursday when we come in. And then we'll move on to the next lecture. So I actually finished 1 lecture in a day. That's good. All right. See y'all in lab.